You've entered void of rules, a realm where normal constraints cease to exist. But beware, traveller, there is one rule here. You've got to hit subscribe. Seriously, it's the only rule we have. We just reached 1,000 brave souls, and we're hunting for 9,000 more to complete our dark ritual. I mean, reach our next goal, so subscribe. Or don't. But remember, the void remembers those who defy the only rule. Now let's get into today's video. The taxi driver refused to take the final stretch of road leading to St. Kirell's Cloister. Insurance doesn't cover that path, he muttered, eyeing the narrow cobblestone track that wound up through the mist-shrouded hills. Besides, nobody goes up there anymore, not since the Hendricks boy went missing last spring. Aldric Thorne paid the fare and shouldered his duffel bag, watching the yellow car disappear back towards the valley. The October wind carried the scent of dying leaves and something else, something metallic and cold that reminded him of old pennies left in the rain. Above him, the monastery, perched on its hill like a stone vulture, its towers disappearing into low-hanging clouds. The cobblestone path had been carved into the hillside centuries ago, worn smooth by countless pilgrims and supplicants who had made this journey seeking absolution or answers. Now weeds pushed through the gaps between stones, and the iron handrails had rusted to the colour of dried blood. Aldric climbed steadily, pausing occasionally to catch his breath and look back at the valley below. He'd taken the security position on impulse, fleeing the wreckage of his life in the city. The divorce had been finalised 3 months ago, along with the sale of their house and the division of everything they built together. His position at the university library had been eliminated in budget cuts the following week, as if the universe had decided to strip away every anchor that had once given his life meaning. The job posting for a night watchman at a remote monastery had appeared on an obscure employment website, offering decent pay and complete solitude, perfect for a man who wanted to disappear. The path took a sharp turn around a cluster of ancient oak trees, their branches twisted into shapes that seemed almost deliberate, almost malevolent. Beyond them, St. Kirell's Cloister revealed itself in full, a sprawling complex of grey stone buildings, connected by covered walkways and surrounded by a high wall topped with iron spikes. The architecture was older than anything Aldric had seen before, predating Gothic or Romanesque styles, as if the builders had followed plans drawn from some forgotten tradition. The main monastery building rose 3 stories, its windows narrow and deep-set like suspicious eyes, but it was the chapel that drew his attention. A separate structure connected to the main building by a covered bridge. The chapel's stained glass windows depicted scenes unlike any religious art he'd encountered. Instead of gentle saints and peaceful nativity scenes, these windows showed divine judgment in vivid, disturbing detail. Angels wielded flaming swords, sinners cowered before towering figures of authority, and in the centre window a massive armoured being dispensed punishment with what appeared to be a flaming censer. Prior Gavriel met him at the heavy wooden doors, appearing so suddenly and silently that Aldric wondered if the man had been watching his approach through the windows. The prior stood barely 5 feet tall, his frame bent with age, but his grey eyes held an intensity that made Aldric want to look away. Most striking were his hands, stained permanently black, as if he'd spent decades handling charcoal or soot, the discoloration extending to his fingernails and the lines of his palms. "You're punctual," Prior Gavriel said, his voice carrying a slight accent that Aldric couldn't identify. Something Eastern European, perhaps, or older than any modern language. "That's important here. Timing is everything at St. Kirell's." The monastery's interior smelled of centuries-old stone and melted wax, with an underlying metallic scent that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Their footsteps echoed through corridors lined with religious paintings, but these weren't the gentle biblical scenes Aldric expected. Every canvas depicted judgment, punishment, and divine retribution. The painted figures seemed to follow their passage with accusing eyes, their expressions shifting subtly when observed peripherally. "The position is straightforward," Prior Gavriel explained as they walked through passages that seemed to extend further than the exterior dimensions of the building should allow. "You'll patrol the grounds from sunset to sunrise, ensuring the security of the complex. There are specific procedures you must follow, protocols developed over many years of experience. Everything you need to know is contained here." He handed Aldric a wax-sealed envelope, the red wax bearing the impression of a censer surrounded by flames. The parchment felt ancient beneath his fingers, much older than any modern security briefing should be. "Don't open it until your first shift begins at sunset," Prior Gavriel instructed, his blackened fingers emphasizing the envelope's importance. "That timing is crucial. The procedures must be understood within the proper context when the monastery reveals its true nature." Aldric examined the seal more closely. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, showing details that seemed to move and shift in the flickering candlelight. "What kind of procedures? Is there something specific I should know about the area?" "The kind that have kept this place secure for over 600 years, Prior Gavriel replied. "Some visitors have called St. Kirell's cursed, claimed it's haunted by malevolent spirits or ancient evils. I prefer to think of it as purposeful. Every stone was placed with intention, every ritual performed with precision. The monastery serves a function that extends far beyond conventional religious practice." They passed through a library filled with leather-bound volumes, their titles written in scripts Aldric didn't recognize. Some books were chained to the shelves, their iron links showing the wear of centuries. Others stood behind locked glass cases, their covers bearing symbols that seemed to writhe and change when viewed directly. The prior led him down a stone staircase to a lower level, where wine cellars had been carved directly into the hillside. The air here was colder, heavy with the weight of earth and time. Stone crypts lined the walls, their covers carved with names and dates going back to the monastery's founding. Some bore epitaphs in Latin, others in languages that predated Roman occupation of the region. The monastery was built on a site of great significance, Prior Gavriel explained, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. The builders chose this location not for its isolation, but for its history. Certain places accumulate spiritual energy over time, becoming focal points for forces beyond normal human understanding. Saint Kirell understood this when he established our order. They climbed back to the main level, where Prior Gavriel showed him to a small security office near the front entrance. A single oil lamp cast dancing shadows across a wooden desk, an ornate analog clock whose hands moved with audible ticking, and a window that provided a clear view of the chapel. The chapel itself seemed different from this angle, its stained glass windows appearing to glow with internal light despite the overcast sky. "I'll leave you to settle in," Prior Gavriel said, pausing in the doorway. "Remember, don't open the envelope until sunset. The transition from day to night is when the monastery's true character emerges, when the procedures become necessary, rather than merely precautionary." He started to leave, then turned back with an expression of genuine concern. "Aldric, whatever you see or hear tonight, whatever you might think you understand about this place, remember that some knowledge comes with a price. The procedures exist for excellent reasons, developed through experiences that I pray you'll never fully comprehend. Follow them exactly, and you'll survive to see another dawn." Alone in the office, Aldric examined his surroundings more carefully. The desk held the envelope, a single black candle whose surface was smooth and unmarked, and a leather-bound ledger filled with entries in various handwritings. The earliest dates went back decades, brief notations about weather conditions, visitor arrivals, and routine maintenance. But as he read forward through time, the entries became stranger, more cryptic. November 15th, 1987. The screaming lasted 4 hours tonight. Johnson barely maintained composure. Note: recruit someone with stronger nerves for next position. March 3rd, 1993. Williams broke Rule 2 at 2:47 a.m. Prior Matthias handled the situation, seeking replacement immediately. June 22nd, 2001. New witness Peterson shows promise. Excellent timing precision, strong resistance to temptation. May survive full term. Aldric flipped to more recent entries, his unease growing with each page. October 4th, 2023. Harrison's fourth night. Significant deterioration observed. Physical manifestations more aggressive than usual. Preparing contingency measures. October 5th, 2023. Harrison failed to maintain Rule 1 at 12:23 a.m. Cleanup completed by dawn, seeking replacement. The final entry was dated just 2 weeks ago. October 20th, 2024. Thorne arrives today. Previous interviews suggest suitable temperament. Pray this one survives longer than his predecessor. As the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky the colour of old blood, Aldric broke the wax seal with trembling fingers. The envelope contained a single sheet of parchment, its surface bearing text written in what appeared to be dried blood, rather than ink. The handwriting was elegant, but urgent, as if the writer had raced against approaching darkness. "You are now a witness to the Holy Executioner," it read. "There are 4 rules you must follow. Break them and you will be judged." Below this declaration, 4 rules were listed in precise handwriting. Do not look directly at the chapel after midnight. If you hear screaming, ignore it. It is not for you. At 3:33 a.m, place the black candle at the altar and light it. No earlier. No later. Never speak to the man in white, no matter what he says. At the bottom of the page, a final line was written in different ink, newer than the rest. The previous witness lasted 4 nights. Can you do better? Aldric read the rules multiple times, searching for context or explanation that never came. The parchment offered no elaboration, no indication of what would happen if the rules were broken, or why these specific prohibitions were necessary. But something in the weight of the words, the careful precision of their placement, suggested consequences more severe than mere employment termination. The first hours of his shift passed in relative quiet. Aldric made rounds through the monastery, his footsteps echoing through corridors that seemed to extend further in darkness than they had in daylight. The religious paintings watched his passage with increasing intensity, their painted eyes following his movement with uncomfortable attention. Twice he stopped to examine specific works more closely, only to discover that the scenes had changed subtly since his earlier visit. Figures faced different directions, expressions showed different emotions, and in one disturbing case, a painted angel's mouth was now open in what appeared to be a silent scream. The monastery's acoustics played tricks on him as he walked. His footsteps seemed to echo not just once, but multiple times, as if other people were walking parallel paths through hidden passages. Sometimes he heard what sounded like distant conversation, whispered exchanges in languages he couldn't identify. When he paused to listen more carefully, the sound stopped immediately, leaving only oppressive silence. Around 11 o'clock, the whispers began. They started as barely audible murmurs, like conversations overheard through thick walls, but gradually gained clarity and volume. Latin phrases drifted through the monastery's stone passages, urgent, pleading voices speaking what sounded like prayers or confessions. The words were too fast and too archaic for Aldric to understand, but the emotional content was unmistakable. Fear, regret, and desperate pleading. Following the sound, he descended to the wine cellars where he'd walked with Prior Gavriel hours earlier. The whispers were stronger here, seeming to emanate from beneath the floor itself. The stone crypts that had appeared merely old during daylight now seemed somehow restless, as if their occupants were stirring in response to some unseen disturbance. At the deepest level of the cellars, Aldric discovered a chamber he hadn't noticed during his earlier tour. Hidden behind what had appeared to be a solid wall, a narrow passage led to a circular room carved directly from bedrock. Ancient symbols covered the walls, not Christian crosses or traditional religious iconography, but something older and more complex. At the center of the room stood a stone altar stained dark with what might have been centuries of burnt offerings. The whispers were strongest in this hidden chamber, dozens of voices speaking over each other in overlapping pleas for mercy or forgiveness. Aldric couldn't understand the words, but the emotions were clear enough to make his skin crawl. These weren't the peaceful prayers of departed souls. They were the desperate cries of the damned, the lost, the judged, and found wanting. He retreated from the chamber, but the whispers followed him through the monastery's corridors. They seemed to be trying to communicate something specific, growing more urgent as midnight approached. Sometimes individual words emerged from the cacophony, warnings in broken English mixed with Latin phrases that sounded like legal proceedings. Witness, judgment, the rules, broken, consumed. Don't trust the prior, the cycle continues. Run, escape, while you still can, before the seal weakens. The voices continued until dawn, when they faded, with the first light filtering through the monastery's narrow windows. Aldric had followed the rules, avoided looking at the chapel after midnight despite overwhelming curiosity, and survived his first night. But as he prepared to leave for his daytime rest in the small apartment Prior Gavriel had provided in the village below, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The painted figures in the corridor were facing different directions than they had the previous day. More disturbing still, some of the painted scenes had acquired new details, additional figures in the backgrounds, extra instruments of judgment in the angels' hands, and expressions of terror where there had once been divine peace. On the second night, Aldric arrived with more confidence, but also deeper apprehension. The monastery felt different as darkness fell, heavier somehow, as if the stones themselves were holding their breath in anticipation of coming events. The religious paintings had changed again during his absence. The scenes now showed figures being dragged toward judgment, angels wielding weapons instead of harps, and expressions of terror rather than divine acceptance. The whispers began earlier this time, starting just after sunset rather than waiting for the late evening hours, but their character had changed. They were less pleading now, more urgent and directive, as if trying to communicate specific information. Aldric found himself straining to understand, catching fragments that seemed almost coherent before dissolving back into archaic Latin. Fourth night, always the fourth night. That's when the seal weakens most. The prior was like you once, a witness until he learned the truth. The rules, they're not protection, they're participation, feeding the prison. At 12:15 a.m., something extraordinary happened. Aldric felt an overwhelming compulsion to look at the chapel, a physical urge so strong it bordered on the supernatural. His neck muscles tensed involuntarily, his head beginning to turn toward the window despite his conscious resistance. The compulsion felt like invisible hands gripping his skull, applying inexorable pressure to force his gaze toward the forbidden sight. He gripped the desk with both hands, fighting the urge with every ounce of willpower he possessed. Sweat broke out across his forehead as he battled against the supernatural influence, his muscles straining as if he were lifting enormous weights. The compulsion built to nearly unbearable intensity before finally releasing its hold, leaving him gasping and shaken. Through his peripheral vision, during his struggle against the compulsion, he caught glimpses of movement that defied rational explanation. Shadows flowed across the monastery walls, independent of any light source, moving like dark water seeking its own level. These weren't shadows cast by visible objects. They moved with purpose and intelligence, reaching towards the chapel with gestures that seemed almost human. Some shadows appeared to be struggling, as if trapped or restrained by invisible bonds. Others moved in formation like soldiers marching to battle. A few seemed to be searching for something, extending tendrils of darkness that probed the monastery's corners and crevices with methodical precision. At 2 o'clock, while still carefully avoiding direct sight of the chapel, Aldric witnessed something that nearly shattered his sanity. A tall figure moved across the moonlit courtyard, dragging something limp and unidentifiable behind it. The figure's movement was wrong in fundamental ways, jerky and puppet-like, as if controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer working from a great distance. The dragged object left a dark trail across the cobblestones, a stain that seemed to absorb moonlight rather than reflect it. The smell that drifted through the window was metallic and sweet, like copper coins soaked in honey, but with an underlying corruption that spoke of decay and spiritual contamination. The tall figure paused directly in front of the chapel doors, which Aldric now noticed were reinforced with iron bands and secured by locks that appeared to predate medieval metalworking. It raised what might have been a face toward his window, though the moonlight revealed nothing but formless shadow where features should be. For a moment that stretched into eternity, Aldric felt that eyeless gaze boring into him, weighing and measuring his soul with clinical precision. The figure remained motionless for several minutes, its attention fixed on the security office with predatory focus. Then, without warning, it began to speak. Its voice carried clearly across the courtyard despite the closed windows, speaking in a language that hurt to hear, words that seemed to bypass the ears and resonate directly in the listener's bones. Aldric couldn't understand the meaning, but the emotional content was unmistakable. Judgment, condemnation, and the promise of inevitable retribution. The voice spoke with the authority of cosmic law, of divine mandate that brooked no appeal or mercy. Finally, the figure resumed its movement, dragging its burden towards the chapel doors, but instead of opening them, it simply passed through, as if the ancient wood and iron were no more substantial than morning mist. The doors remained closed and locked, but the figure and its terrible cargo had somehow moved beyond them into the chapel's interior. At exactly 3 o'clock, the screaming began. It erupted across the hills like a dam bursting, releasing a flood of human agony that had been building for centuries. Not one voice, but hundreds. Men, women, children, all crying out in harmonized suffering that spoke of unimaginable torment. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, reverberating through the monastery's foundations and drilling into Aldric's skull like sonic needles. He covered his ears, but the screaming continued unabated, growing more desperate and more personal with each passing moment. Some voices called out specific names, people they failed to save, loved ones they betrayed, enemies they'd wronged. Others spoke words in languages long dead, pleading for mercy from judges who would never grant it. A few voices stood out from the cacophony, speaking directly to Aldric, with intimate knowledge of his life and failures. They knew about his marriage, about the small cruelties and large neglects that had driven his wife away. They knew about his career, about opportunities missed through pride and cowardice. They knew things about him that he'd never told another soul, secrets that festered in the darkest corners of his conscience. Aldric Thorne, one voice called out above the others, speaking with his ex-wife's intonation but carrying an authority she'd never possessed. You think you're innocent, but we know better. We know about the night you came home drunk and she was crying, and you pretended to be asleep rather than ask what was wrong. We know about the promotion you sabotaged for your colleague because you were afraid of being shown up. We know about your father's funeral, how you stayed away because facing your family's disappointment was too painful. The accusations continued, each one striking him like a physical blow. The voices knew things that were true, but which he'd rationalized away. Failures of character that he'd minimized or forgotten entirely. They painted a picture of his life that was accurate, but utterly damning, showing him patterns of selfishness and cowardice that he'd never acknowledged. The screaming built to a crescendo around 3:30, then suddenly stopped, leaving a silence so complete it was almost worse than the noise. In that absolute quiet, Aldric could hear his own heart beating, his breathing too loud in the suffocating stillness. At 3:33 a.m. exactly, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the match, Aldric placed the black candle at the altar and lit it. The flame that emerged was unlike anything in his experience. It burned with a blue tint that seemed to absorb light rather than cast it, creating a sphere of darkness that made the surrounding shadows seem bright by comparison. The flame flickered without any wind, forming shapes that looked almost like faces before dissolving back into fire. Sometimes Aldric thought he could see specific features in the dancing light, eyes wide with terror, mouths open in silent screams, hands reaching out in desperate supplication. The faces changed constantly, as if the flame contained an entire population of the damned, all struggling to escape their fiery prison. When dawn finally came, Aldric noticed profound changes in himself. His hair, which had been completely brown the day before, now showed prominent streaks of grey at the temples and scattered throughout. His hands had developed a persistent tremor that made simple tasks difficult. Most disturbing of all, his reflection in the bathroom mirror looked older, more haggard, as if the single night had aged him several years. But the changes weren't just physical. His memories of the previous day seemed somehow distant, as if viewed through frosted glass. Details that had once been sharp and clear now felt uncertain, malleable. He found himself questioning things he'd always known to be true, doubting the reliability of his own perceptions. The painted figures in the monastery corridors were definitely different now. Not only had they changed positions and expressions, but some scenes contained entirely new elements, additional figures in the backgrounds, new instruments of judgment, and architectural details that definitely hadn't been there before. It was as if the paintings were evolving, growing more complex and more terrible with each passing night. The third night arrived with an atmosphere of palpable menace. Aldric approached the monastery as sunset painted the sky the colour of dried blood, noting that even the landscape around the building seemed altered. The twisted oak trees appeared more gnarled, their branches reaching toward the stone walls like arthritic fingers. The path up the hillside felt longer, steeper, as if the very geography was becoming hostile to human presence. Inside the monastery, the oppressive atmosphere had intensified dramatically. The air itself felt thick and metallic, with a taste like copper pennies dissolving on his tongue. The smell of old incense mixed with something rotten pervaded every corridor, growing stronger as darkness fell. The religious paintings had transformed completely. Now every scene showed divine judgment in its most terrifying forms, with the recurring figure of a massive armoured being dispensing punishment to cowering humans. The whispers began immediately after sunset, but now they spoke in English rather than Latin, calling his name with increasing urgency and familiarity. "Aldric," they pleaded, "Aldric, you have to listen to us. You don't understand what you're doing here. The rules aren't protection, they're participation. Every night you follow them, you're feeding something that should have died centuries ago." He tried to ignore the voices, but they became more insistent, more personal with each passing hour. They spoke of things no one else could know, intimate details of his life, his thoughts, his dreams and nightmares. They knew about the recurring dream where his ex-wife returned to him, only to transform into something monstrous when he tried to embrace her. They knew about his secret fear that he was fundamentally broken, incapable of maintaining meaningful relationships with other human beings. "We were like you once," the voices continued. "We took the job, we read the rules, We thought we were just night watchmen, earning an unusual paycheck, but the truth is so much worse. You're not a security guard, Aldric. You're a sacrifice offered up piece by piece, night by night, until there's nothing left but another voice in the darkness. The accusations grew more specific and more devastating as the night progressed. The voices spoke of moral failures he'd tried to forget, moments of cowardice and selfishness that had shaped his life in ways he'd never wanted to acknowledge. They painted a picture of a man who'd consistently chosen his own comfort over the needs of others, who'd built his life on a foundation of small betrayals and casual cruelties. "Remember Sarah Morrison from the library?" one voice asked, speaking with perfect knowledge of his past. "The graduate student who needed your help with her research project. You could have given her access to the restricted archives, could have made her work possible. But you were afraid your supervisor might disapprove, so you let her fail instead. She never finished her degree, never became the scholar she could have been. How many lives have you diminished through your cowardice?" The psychological assault continued relentlessly, each accusation striking closer to the core of his deepest insecurities. The voices knew things about him that he'd never admitted to himself, failures of character that he'd buried beneath layers of rationalization and self-deception. At 1:45 a.m, the man in white appeared. He materialized outside the chapel like condensed moonlight, standing perfectly motionless in flowing white robes that seemed to generate their own luminescence. Where his face should have been, there was only a smooth expanse of pale skin, as if someone had forgotten to complete his creation. But despite his lack of features, his presence radiated intelligence and malevolent purpose. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly through the glass, and it was Aldric's ex-wife's voice. Not just the sound, but the exact intonation, the slight breathiness that had always made his heart race. "Aldric," she called. "Aldric, please, you have to help me. I'm trapped here, and I can't get out. Something terrible has happened, and I need you to open the door for me." Aldric's hand moved toward the door handle before he consciously realized what he was doing. The voice was perfect, not just similar, but identical in every detail. It carried all the warmth and affection he remembered from their best moments together, the tone she'd used when telling him she loved him, when sharing her deepest hopes and fears. "That's not her," he whispered to himself, but the man in white continued speaking. "I know you're angry about the divorce," the voice said, now carrying a note of desperation that tugged at his heart. "I know I hurt you, and I'm sorry. But whatever our problems were, surely you won't leave me here to suffer. You're a good man, Aldric. You wouldn't abandon someone in need, even someone who's hurt you." The voice shifted seamlessly to his father's commanding tone, the voice of authority that had shaped his childhood. "Son, you open that door right now. I didn't raise you to ignore someone in distress. You've always been too hesitant, too worried about consequences that might never come. Sometimes you have to act on faith. Trust that doing the right thing will work out in the end." Then it became his mother's worried whisper, the voice that had comforted him through every childhood nightmare. "Aldric, honey, I'm scared. There's something in here with me, something that wants to hurt me. Please, I know you're a good boy. I know you won't let anything happen to your mother. Just open the door, sweetheart. Just this once, listen to your heart instead of your head." The man in white pressed against the window, his featureless face somehow conveying desperate emotion through posture and gesture alone. His voice became a chorus of every person Aldric had ever loved, every authority figure he'd ever respected, every vulnerable person he'd ever wanted to protect. "We're all here," the chorus said, speaking in perfect harmony of familiar voices. "Everyone you've ever failed to save, everyone you've ever disappointed. We're trapped here because of your weakness, your inability to act when action was required. But you can change that now. You can finally do the right thing, finally be the man you've always wanted to be." The psychological manipulation became increasingly sophisticated, as the hours passed. The man in white didn't just mimic voices. He perfectly recreated entire conversations, playing out scenarios that felt absolutely real. Aldric found himself reliving arguments with his ex-wife, hearing words of disappointment from his parents, experiencing moments of connection with friends he'd lost touch with over the years. "You always said you'd be there for me," the voice of his childhood friend Michael said, speaking with perfect accuracy of tone and vocabulary. "Remember when we were 12 and I told you I was afraid my parents were getting divorced? You promised you'd always be my friend, no matter what happened. But when high school came and I wasn't cool enough for your new crowd, you dropped me like yesterday's newspaper. I needed you then, and you weren't there. Don't make the same mistake again." Each recreation was flawless, drawing on memories that Aldric had thought were completely private. The man in white seemed to have access not just to the basic facts of his life, but to the emotional context that gave those facts their power to wound. He knew exactly which buttons to push, which vulnerabilities to exploit, which regrets would resonate most deeply. The assault continued until dawn, becoming more vicious and more personal with each passing hour. The man in white spoke of every mistake Aldric had ever made, every opportunity he'd missed through fear or selfishness, every person he'd hurt through action or inaction. By the time the first light appeared on the horizon, Aldric felt spiritually flayed, as if every protective layer of self-deception had been stripped away to reveal the damaged core beneath. When he lit the candle at 3:33 a.m, the flame burned completely black, a sphere of absolute darkness that seemed to pull light from the surrounding area. Looking into that dark fire was like staring into the void between stars, into spaces where no human soul was meant to venture. The man in white watched from outside the chapel, his smooth face somehow conveying satisfaction and anticipation, before vanishing with the sunrise. The fourth night arrived with Aldric already broken in ways that went beyond the merely physical. His hair was now more grey than brown, and his hands shook constantly, making even simple tasks like holding a pen or lighting a match enormously difficult. But the psychological damage was far worse. He felt hollowed out, as if the previous nights had burned away everything that had once made him recognisably human. The monastery itself seemed to sense his deterioration. The building felt actively malevolent now, with stones that shifted when he wasn't looking directly at them, and corridors that seemed to stretch longer than physically possible. The religious artwork had become nightmarish, showing scenes of the armoured figure, the holy executioner, dispensing judgment with methodical cruelty, while victims screamed in the background. The whispers began immediately after sunset, but now they were angry rather than pleading, accusatory rather than warning. 4 nights, they said in voices that seemed to come from the stones themselves. 4 nights you've been feeding it, strengthening it, helping it prepare for what comes next. Did you think the rules were meant to protect you? They're meant to protect everyone else from what you're about to unleash. Aldric tried to ignore them, but the voices were relentless and increasingly specific. They spoke of other witnesses, other security guards who had sat in this same chair and followed these same rules. They described what happened when someone made a mistake, when the timing was wrong, when the carefully maintained balance was disrupted. Richardson lasted 6 nights before he broke, one voice reported with clinical detachment. He looked at the chapel at 12:47 a.m. on his final night. The screaming lasted until dawn, and when Prior Matthias found him, there wasn't enough left to identify without dental records. Williams made it 3 weeks before the pressure got to him, another voice added. He tried to run on his 21st night, abandoning his post at 2:15 a.m. They found him at the bottom of the hill, but something had gotten to him first. The coroner said he'd been dead for hours before he fell, though witnesses saw him running just minutes earlier. Patterson broke Rule 4 on his second night, a third voice continued. Started talking to the man in white, trying to negotiate some kind of deal. The conversation lasted 6 hours, and by dawn he was catatonic. Spent the rest of his life in an asylum speaking only in languages that didn't exist. He died last year, still screaming about judgment and the need for perfect timing. The voices continued their litany of failure and consequence, describing dozens of previous witnesses who had broken under the pressure or made fatal errors. Each story was told with perfect detail, as if the speakers had witnessed every moment of suffering and failure. Throughout the night, Aldric fought off increasingly vivid hallucinations of his past failures and future punishments. He saw his ex-wife packing her bags while explaining, with devastating clarity, exactly why their marriage had been doomed from the beginning. He saw himself at his father's funeral, standing at the back of the chapel because that he was too ashamed to sit with family members who knew how rarely he'd visited during the old man's final illness. But most disturbing were the visions that showed him alternate versions of his life, paths he might have taken if he'd been braver, kinder, more willing to sacrifice his own comfort for the good of others. He saw himself as a successful scholar, respected for groundbreaking research that had helped countless students. He saw himself as a loving husband and father, building a family based on genuine care rather than selfish need. He saw himself as a son who'd honoured his parents, a friend who'd kept his promises, a man who'd lived up to his own moral standards. These visions of what might have been were more painful than any accusation of actual wrongdoing, because they showed him exactly how much potential he'd wasted through fear and selfishness. They demonstrated that his failures weren't the result of impossible circumstances or tragic fate, but of countless small choices to take the easier path, to avoid risk, to prioritize his own comfort over the needs of others. As 3:30 a.m. approached, the visions became more intense and more personal. Aldrich found himself reliving specific moments of moral failure with perfect clarity, feeling again the weight of decisions that had shaped his life in ways he'd never fully acknowledged. The emotional impact was overwhelming, leaving him unable to distinguish between memory and hallucination, between past and present. At 3:32 a.m., convinced he heard his watch ticking toward 3:33, overwhelmed by guilt and desperate to complete his final ritual, Aldric rushed to the altar with the black candle. His hands shook as he struck the match, and the flame caught just as he realized his terrible mistake. The watch on his wrist clearly showed 3:32 a.m. He had lit the candle 1 minute too early. For a moment, nothing happened. The candle burned with its usual dark flame. The monastery remained silent, and Aldric began to hope that perhaps his error was too small to matter. But then the ground began to shake. It started as a gentle tremor, like the first warning of a distant earthquake, but quickly built to a violent shuddering that cracked the ancient stones of the monastery. The religious paintings fell from their hooks, their frames splintering as they struck the floor. Books tumbled from shelves in the library, their ancient bindings splitting to release pages that scattered like frightened birds. The whispers rose to a crescendo of panic and despair, hundreds of voices crying out in terror and accusation. "Now you've done it," they cried in unison, their voices blending into a symphony of despair. 1 minute too early and centuries of imprisonment are weakened. The seal breaks tonight, the holy executioner rises, and all the world will know divine judgment once again. The trembling intensified, and Aldric heard something that chilled him to his very core. The sound of ancient metal grinding against stone, of locks that had held for centuries finally giving way. From the chapel came a noise like thunder, but deeper, more fundamental, as if the earth itself was splitting open to release something that had been buried since the dawn of time. The chapel doors, which had remained sealed throughout his watch, burst open with a sound that shattered every remaining window in the monastery. The iron bands that had reinforced them for centuries snapped like thread. The massive locks exploded into fragments of twisted metal, and something emerged from the darkness within. The holy executioner stood 10 feet tall in the chapel doorway, its presence so overwhelming that Aldric's mind struggled to process what he was seeing. The creature's body was encased in armor that had once been polished steel, but was now rusted to the color of dried blood, each plate bearing inscriptions in languages that predated human civilization. The armor moved with impossible flexibility, as if it were part of the creature's body rather than something worn over it. Where the executioner's face should have been, there was only an empty void that seemed to pull at Aldric's soul, drawing him forward with irresistible force. The emptiness was not mere absence, but active negation, a space where light, sound, and hope went to die. Looking into that void was like staring into the final moment of the universe, when entropy had consumed all matter and energy, leaving nothing but perfect, eternal darkness. In its right hand, the executioner dragged a massive censer that sparked and smoked, trailing fire and the screams of the damned. The censer was wrought from the same dark metal as the armor, its surface carved with scenes of judgment that moved and shifted as Aldric watched. Faces appeared in the metal, mouths open in eternal screams, hands reaching out in desperate supplication before being consumed by the flowing designs and replaced by new expressions of terror. The creature began to move, and each step sent shockwaves through the monastery's foundations. Its armor clanked with a rhythm like funeral bells, like the countdown to the end of all things. The very air around it seemed to writhe and distort, as if reality itself was struggling to accommodate something that should not exist in the mortal world. Aldric Thorne, the executioner, spoke, its voice like grinding stone, like the collapse of mountains, like the final judgment of a dying god. The words bypassed his ears entirely, resonating directly in his bones, his blood, the very structure of his soul. You have been weighed in the balance and found wanting. You have broken the sacred timing, weakened the bonds that hold me, and now you must face judgment for your failures. The creature's voice contained multitudes, not just one speaker, but hundreds, thousands of voices, all speaking in perfect unison. Aldric recognized some of them, victims of plagues and wars, criminals executed for their crimes, martyrs who had died for their beliefs. All of them had been judged by this creature. All of them had been found wanting, and now their voices formed part of its terrible authority. You thought the rules were arbitrary, the executioner continued, its voice growing louder with each word, each syllable striking Aldric like a physical blow. You thought they were merely superstition, designed to frighten the weak-minded into compliance. But every rule has a purpose. Every timing has cosmic significance. You have lit the candle 1 minute too early, and in doing so, you have proven yourself unworthy of the responsibility placed upon you. Aldric tried to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. His body had become a prison, trapping him in place while his mind screamed for escape. He watched in frozen horror as the executioner approached, its censer swinging with hypnotic rhythm. In the flames that danced around the metal sphere, he could see faces, other security guards, other witnesses who had failed to follow the rules with perfect precision. There was Harrison, the man whose final entry Aldric had read in the security log. His face was frozen in an expression of terminal terror, his mouth open in a scream that would continue for all eternity. Beside him was Williams, whose eyes showed the madness that had consumed him in his final moments. And there were others, dozens of them, all trapped within the executioner's terrible instrument of judgment. "You are not the first to fail," the executioner said, raising its censer with deliberate ceremony. "You will not be the last. But your failure will serve a purpose, as all failures do. Your soul will join the others, and your terror will feed the flames that maintain the seal. In death, you will finally be useful." The creature began to recite Aldric's sins. not just his rule-breaking, but every moral failing throughout his entire life. It spoke of his selfishness during the divorce, how he had fought for possessions rather than trying to save his marriage. It detailed his pride that had cost him his career. His inability to accept help or admit weakness when doing so might have preserved his position. It catalogued his neglect of his aging parents, his casual cruelties to those who had tried to help him, his pattern of choosing personal comfort over moral obligation. But the executioner didn't stop with the obvious failures. It delved deeper, revealing character flaws that Aldric had never even recognized in himself. It spoke of opportunities for kindness that he had ignored, of chances to make a positive difference that he had let slip by through inaction. It revealed the cumulative weight of 1,000 small betrayals, tiny compromises that had gradually eroded his humanity until nothing remained but a hollow shell of selfishness and fear. "You could have been better," the executioner intoned, its voice carrying the weight of cosmic disappointment. "Every day of your life you were presented with choices between selfishness and sacrifice, between fear and courage, between comfort and duty. Every day you chose the easier path, telling yourself that the small failures didn't matter, that you would do better tomorrow. But tomorrow never came, and now it is too late for redemption." The litany of failures continued for what felt like hours, each accusation perfectly accurate, each judgment irrefutable. The executioner knew things about Aldric that he had never admitted to himself, patterns of behaviour that revealed the true poverty of his character. It painted a picture of a life wasted not through tragic circumstances or impossible choices, but through the accumulated weight of moral cowardice. "Sarah Morrison," the executioner said, and Aldric's heart sank as he realized the creature knew about every person he had failed. "The graduate student who needed your help with her research. You had the power to assist her, the authority to grant access to the material she needed. But you chose caution over compassion, self-preservation over service. She never completed her degree, never became the scholar she could have been. Her potential died because you were afraid of minor inconvenience." The accusations became more specific, more personal. The executioner spoke of Michael Chen, the childhood friend he had abandoned when maintaining that friendship became socially awkward. It described the homeless veteran he had passed on the street just weeks before taking this job, how he had averted his eyes rather than offering the help that might have made a difference. It detailed conversations with his ex-wife, where he had chosen to be right rather than kind. Moments where a small gesture of genuine care might have saved their marriage. Every soul you failed to help, every heart you broke through selfishness, every opportunity for goodness you squandered, all of it led to this moment, the executioner continued. "You are here not by accident, but by design. The universe has a way of bringing judgment to those who have avoided it for too long. Tonight, you face the consequences of a lifetime spent choosing yourself over others." The censer swung closer, its flames reaching toward Aldric with eager hunger. He could feel the heat against his face, could hear the voices of previous victims crying out from within the fire. They spoke his name now, welcoming him to their eternal torment, promising him a special place among the condemned. But just as the flaming censer was about to touch him, just as Aldric prepared to join the chorus of the damned, the air filled with the sound of ancient chanting. Prior Gavriel appeared in the doorway, his small frame somehow commanding, despite the presence of the towering executioner. His voice rose in a language that predated Latin, predated any human tongue, speaking words that seemed to reshape reality through their utterance. The very air around him shimmered with power, and symbols of light appeared in the darkness, pressing back against the creature's overwhelming presence. The executioner halted, its censer still raised, but no longer moving toward its target. It didn't retreat, such a creature was incapable of retreat, but it waited, as if receiving new instructions from some higher authority. Its eyeless gaze turned toward the prior, and when it spoke, its voice carried a note of recognition. Gavriel ben Mordecai, it intoned, using a name that Aldric had never heard before. Once you were like him, a witness, a sacrifice, a soul offered up to maintain the ancient bonds. But you survived where others failed, learned where others remained ignorant. Now you serve a different function in the great design. Prior Gavriel continued his chanting, but his eyes met Aldric's with an expression of genuine sorrow. "I'm sorry," he said, his normal voice barely audible beneath the ancient words of power. "I'm sorry you had to learn the truth this way, but the system requires it, the balance demands it, and some knowledge can only be gained through direct experience." "You see," the prior continued, his chanting temporarily suspended, "the truth is not what you expected. St. Kirell's Cloister was never truly Christian. Never a conventional monastery serving the gentle god of love and forgiveness. It was built by medieval inquisitors as a prison for something far older and more terrible, a fallen celestial being, a former angel of justice who became corrupted by its own righteousness." The executioner stood motionless during this explanation, its presence still overwhelming, but somehow contained by the prior's mystical authority. Aldric could feel the creature's attention focused on him, weighing and measuring his soul, even as Prior Gavriel revealed the truth behind his employment. "The being you see before you was once Raguel, the angel of justice, one of the 7 archangels who stood before the throne of the Most High," the prior explained. "But justice without mercy becomes tyranny, and judgment without compassion becomes cruelty. Raguel began to see sin and imperfection everywhere, began to believe that humanity deserved nothing but punishment for its failures. When the other angels tried to restrain him, he declared war on heaven itself." The prior's words painted a picture of cosmic conflict, of a war between angels that had raged across dimensions before finally being contained through a combination of divine intervention and human ingenuity. The medieval inquisitors, despite their own moral failings, had managed to create a prison that could hold a being of such immense power, but only through constant maintenance, constant sacrifice. "The witnesses aren't guards," Prior Gavriel continued, his voice heavy with centuries of accumulated guilt. "They're living anchors, their terror and perfect obedience, maintaining the spiritual bonds that keep Raguel imprisoned. The rules aren't arbitrary, they're sympathetic magic, rituals that reinforce the original binding through repeated performance." Aldric felt understanding dawn like a cold sunrise. Every night he had followed the rules, he had been participating in a centuries-old ritual of containment. Every candle he had lit at precisely 3:33 a.m. had strengthened the mystical chains that bound the fallen angel. Every moment of terror he had experienced had fed power into the prison that kept humanity safe from divine judgment. "Those who break the rules too severely are consumed by Raguel, their souls added to his power," the prior continued. "But those who survive the full term, who can maintain perfect obedience for exactly 1 month, are offered a choice. They can leave, their memories altered to forget what they've experienced, or they can remain and take on the responsibilities of maintaining the prison." The executioner, Raguel, finally spoke again, its voice carrying centuries of frustrated rage. "You promised them redemption, Gavriel. You told them that perfect service would earn them salvation, but there is no redemption for the flawed, no salvation for the imperfect. This one has proven his unworthiness through a single minute of imprecision. The timing was wrong, the ritual was flawed, and now the bonds weaken." Prior Gavriel's chanting resumed, but Aldric could see strain in the old man's face. Maintaining control over such a powerful entity was taking a visible toll, aging him before Aldric's eyes. "The bonds still hold," he said between mystical phrases. "One small error, 1 minute of imprecision. It's not enough to break the prison completely. but it is enough to justify judgment. The cycle continues as it must, the prior continued, his voice growing weaker with each word. I too was once a witness, standing where you stand now, facing the same choices and the same consequences. I survived my month-long trial, but survival came with its own price. The responsibility to recruit new witnesses, to maintain the prison, to perpetuate a system that destroys the innocent, to protect the many. Aldric realized with growing horror that Prior Gavriel was dying. The effort of controlling Raguel was consuming his life force, burning through decades of accumulated spiritual energy in a matter of minutes. The old man's hands, already stained black from years of ritual candlelighting, were beginning to crumble like ash. Before me, there was Prior Matthias, Gavriel gasped, his chanting becoming more laboured, and before him, Prior Constantine, and before him dozens of others, stretching back to the monastery's founding. We all started as witnesses, as sacrificial offerings to feed the prison. Those who survived were given the choice between freedom and responsibility. Those who chose responsibility became the next guardians of humanity's darkest secret. The executioner raised its censer higher, and Aldric could feel the heat of its flames pressing against his face. "The witness has failed," Raguel declared. "The ritual was flawed, the timing imperfect. Judgment must be rendered. Balance must be restored. His soul will join the others, and the prison will be strengthened by his terror." But Prior Gavriel had one final card to play. With his last breath, he spoke a single word in the ancient language, a word that seemed to reshape reality around them. The monastery's stones responded to his command, ancient symbols carved into the foundation blazing with sudden light. The very walls began to sing with mystical energy, harmonizing with frequencies that existed beyond normal human perception. "The emergency protocols," the prior whispered, as his body began to dissolve into light, established by the original builders for situations exactly like this one. When a witness fails, but the failure is not severe enough to break the prison completely, when the balance requires adjustment but not complete destruction. The singing stones created a new pattern of containment, one that encompassed both Aldric and the executioner. Raguel found himself bound not just by the ancient chains, but by a web of power that incorporated the failed witness into the prison structure. Aldric felt himself being drawn into the mystical matrix, his consciousness becoming part of the containment system. "You wanted to be useful," Prior Gavriel's fading voice echoed through the monastery. "You wanted your life to have meaning, to serve a purpose greater than your own selfish desires. Now you will have that chance, not as a witness, not as a guardian, but as a living component of the prison itself." Aldric felt his physical form beginning to change, his flesh transforming into something more suited to his new role. He was becoming part of the monastery's foundation. His consciousness spread throughout the ancient stones. His will merged with the mystical forces that kept Raguel contained. He would experience every moment of the fallen angel's imprisonment, feel every instant of its frustrated rage, but he would also have the power to maintain the bonds that protected humanity. "The new prior will arrive soon," Gavriel's voice continued, now speaking directly into Aldric's transformed consciousness. "Someone chosen for their potential, their hidden strength, their ability to bear the weight of terrible knowledge. They will be told that you died in an accident, that the position requires a replacement. They will receive the same envelope, read the same rules, face the same tests." Raguel's voice cut through the mystical transformation with cold authority. "You think this changes anything, old man? You think turning one failed witness into a living prison bar somehow negates the judgment I am bound to render? The timing was wrong, the ritual was flawed, and cosmic law demands satisfaction." But the executioner found that its power had been redirected rather than defeated. Instead of consuming Aldric's soul outright, it was forced to judge him continuously, eternally. its divine authority channeled into maintaining the very prison that contained it. The fallen angel's need to punish imperfection had been turned into a component of its own containment, a cruel irony that would torment it for as long as the monastery stood. Aldric's last thought as his individual consciousness dissolved into the collective awareness of the prison was a mixture of terror and strange satisfaction. He had failed as a witness, broken the rules through a single minute of imprecision, but his failure had been transformed into service. His soul would indeed be useful, not as fuel for Riguel's power, but as part of the mystical mechanism that kept the fallen angel bound. The monastery fell silent as the transformation completed itself. The scattered books returned to their shelves, the fallen paintings righted themselves on the walls, and the ancient stones settled back into their eternal vigil. But now the building itself was different, strengthened by the addition of a new component to its mystical structure. Prior Gavriel's body had completely dissolved, leaving only his stained cassock draped over the chair where he had made his final stand. In his place, the emergency protocols had already begun to manifest a new guardian, not a former witness this time, but someone chosen directly by the monastery's mystical intelligence for their suitability to the role. She appeared gradually, condensing from the shadows like morning mist, taking human form. Sister Veronica Blackthorne had been a scholar of medieval mysticism, a woman who had dedicated her life to understanding the hidden currents of spiritual power that flowed beneath the surface of organized religion. She had been studying alone in her private library when the monastery's call reached her, drawing her consciousness across continents to inhabit a new body specially created for her role. Unlike the priors who had preceded her, Sister Veronica understood from the moment of her manifestation exactly what Saint Kirell's cloister truly was and what function she was meant to serve. The monastery's mystical intelligence had chosen her specifically for this knowledge, this ability to accept terrible truths without being paralyzed by their implications. She examined the transformed space with professional interest, noting how Aldric's consciousness had been integrated into the building's spiritual architecture. His awareness now permeated every stone, every wooden beam, every piece of metal in the monastery's construction. He had become a living component of the prison. His will merged with the ancient binding spells in ways that made the containment stronger than it had ever been before. The black candle still burned on the altar, its flame now permanently dark, fed by the constant flow of power from Aldric's transformed soul. The executioner had returned to its chapel, but Sister Veronica could feel its presence like a weight pressing against the edges of reality. Riguel was more contained than ever, but also more dangerous, its fury at being outmaneuvered, adding new dimensions to its malevolent presence. Sister Veronica began preparing the next phase of the cycle, crafting a new envelope with new rules for the next witness. The system would continue as it had for centuries, but now it was stronger, more stable, better able to contain the fallen angel's power. Aldric's failure had become a cornerstone of humanity's protection, his imperfection transformed into a component of something far greater than he could have imagined. The advertisement for a night security position at a remote monastery would appear on an obscure employment website within the week. Someone desperate enough, isolated enough, and fundamentally flawed enough would read it and think it sounded perfect for their situation. They would make the journey up the cobblestone path, meet Sister Veronica at the heavy wooden doors, and receive their own wax-sealed envelope. And the cycle would continue as it had for 600 years, as it would until the end of time itself. Because some prisons require constant maintenance, some secrets demand eternal vigilance, and some judgments can only be contained through the willing sacrifice of imperfect souls. In the depths of the monastery, Aldric's consciousness touched every stone and timber, feeling the weight of centuries and the promise of centuries to come. He was no longer merely human, but he was finally truly useful. His failure had been transformed into service, his judgment into salvation, his death into a kind of immortality that would protect countless generations from the terrible justice of a fallen angel. The holy executioner waited in its chapel, bound by chains of mystical force and human sacrifice, its divine fury contained but never eliminated. It would continue to judge, continue to condemn, but its judgments would serve only to strengthen the prison that held it. And Aldric Thorne, failed witness and imperfect man, would be there to ensure that the balance was maintained, that the rules were followed, and that humanity remained safe from the terrible mercy of absolute justice. The monastery stood silent under the stars, its ancient stones singing with power both holy and terrible, a fortress of imperfection guarding the world against the dangers of divine perfection. And in the darkness, Sister Veronica began to write the first lines of the next witness's instructions, preparing another soul for the test that awaited all who dared to serve as guardians at the threshold between judgment and mercy. The story would begin again tomorrow with a new protagonist and the same ancient rules, the same terrible choices, and the same transformation of failure into service. Because that was the way of St. Kirell's Cloister, where the holy executioner waited in eternal judgment, and where imperfect souls learned that sometimes the greatest service came through the acceptance of their own inadequacy.